our next talk by Gilad Lotan, Vice President of Research and Development at Social Flow.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for having me here. I'm really honored to be able to attend, as especially someone from industry, not academia. It's been really, really interesting for me to just hear the discussions, and I hope what I have to show you will be a contribution to the continuation of the discussion. So I'm a data scientist. A lot of what I do is analyze information, especially on social media. I'll tell you a little bit about sort of my job, the startup that I'm with in New York City, and the type of stuff that we do. And then I want to dive into the data a little bit. So just show you, we mine the whole Twitter fire hose. So we look at everything publicly posted on Twitter in real time. So just what does that data look like? What type of things can we do? And some of the analyses that we do, we're very interested in audiences, so understanding networked audiences. A lot of our customers are media companies or brands or anyone who's trying to have conversations with these networks online. And then I'm going to talk, in the latter half of the talk, I'm going to present a paper that I co-wrote with Dana and a number of other folks from the Web Ecology Group. It's titled "The Revolutions Were Tweeted," and it's an analysis of information flows during the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. And it's based on Twitter data that we acquired separately. And I'm hoping we can get to a discussion where it's not only Q&A, but we can actually talk about different aspects of data acquisition and analysis. So that's the plan. We have an hour to go, which is great. So I'm a data scientist. I'm at SocialFlow. And effectively what I do as a data scientist sort of intersects three main areas. I work a lot on product, so I constantly think of ways to visualize data, think of ways to sort of make our algorithms better in order to draw insight and help our customers understand their audience in a better way. And I'll explain a little bit more what the product is, just so you have a general understanding. Then a lot of what I do as well is sort of this business development. So based on the product, based on the data, understand how we can acquire new customers. So looking at specific data sets, looking at slices of audiences to sort of carve out interesting dynamics and then present it to these different businesses. And then a third thing of what I do, I call it PR, but effectively publishing, which turns into PR. So just putting out a lot of interesting stories about what we see in the data. It doesn't always have to be exactly related to our product, just like really interesting things that we think people should know about. Sometimes I call that data philanthropy. Like nowadays when something happens online, especially on Twitter, I get tens of emails from journalists who want to know what's going on in order to sort of to talk about the story, but don't have access to neither the data or the tools to analyze the data. So those three pieces have become sort of core of what I as a data scientist do. So for the product part, what I do is a lot of prediction. So given a piece of text, how can we predict how well it will do, how it will spread through the network? I work closely with media outlets such as The Economist, Washington Post, even the AP and Reuters. They have a ton of content that they could potentially publish to Twitter, to Facebook. So how do they choose what to publish and when? So a lot of what we do is model audiences. So look at their audiences. Who fans them on Facebook? Who follows them on Twitter? What have they been excited by in the past? What are people talking about right now? What are people attentive to? How is sort of attention within the audience shifting at any given moment? And then make predictions on what we think will be the best piece of content to publish right now. So we call it attention score, resonance prediction. We highlight trends from audiences. So things you can't really get anywhere else. On Twitter, people who follow me, what are they talking about, right? And just general sort of visualizations of activity. So this is sort of the more practical part of what I do. This is sort of a lot of what I do in addition is sort of look at the data and try to map out these information flows. So Sasha showed this visualization beforehand. It highlights sort of the network dynamics taking place during the Occupy sort of cleanup rumors, which happened for the New York City occupation in the beginning of October. So there were rumors that came out in the middle of the night. They were saying that Zuccotti Park was going to evict everyone because they needed to clean up the park. Within hours, it was spread all over mainstream media, and this is started at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. I think by 6, 7 a.m. Hundreds of people were sort of called to the location, and all these outlets were reporting. So you could see sort of one of the major nodes in disseminating information on this event was the formal Occupy Wall Street New York City handle, and all these other Occupy handles like Occupy Wall Street and Occupy LA. But you'll notice all these additional sort of quite large mainstream media outlets that were playing a key role in this flow. Breaking News, AP, Huffington Post, even Sockington the cat. I don't know if you've ever gone on Twitter to Sockington. He's this profile of a cat that apparently is quite revolutionary and is spreading a lot of information, because look at how many responses he got. So if we rewind this same network, the same event back a few months, we see sort of very different story play out. These are the very first references of Occupy Wall Street on Twitter. And what you see is sort of, this is a network that instead of a few hours like the previous one, this evolves over 10 days. So this full network is sort of really, really slowly evolving. And you see, yes, there's still sort of the central Occupy Wall Street, New York City account that's sort of very central to the flow, but also Adbusters, which we know the connection between Adbusters and Occupy. And what's interesting actually when you dive into the different profiles here is you notice sort of these arm of different Spanish profiles who are very, very excited by this call, by the Adbusters call. So you see all these profiles here who post in Spanish and notice the call and are talking about how they're excited if this would pick up in New York City. So, yeah?
Sorry, the edges here are retweets?
The edges here are retweets or mentions, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, stop me at any point if you have questions. There'll be,
So you said something, this represents dynamics network, or is it just aggregate over, it's a static graph?
over 10 days, yes. Yeah. So I'm gonna just whip you through a whole bunch of data just to show you the kind of things that we can do, and then we'll get back to a bunch of interesting audience analyses. So this is what we see. We have at any given moment, I can query our systems and see sort of general counts for any word, any hashtag, any mention, any reference or citation of a term or phrase within the network. And the network, in this case I'm talking about, is Twitter. So the whole of Twitter, of public updates sent through Twitter. So this is just a general query. We're seeing morning in red, tired in blue, coffee in green, and Starbucks in dark blue. And it's as we'd expect. People talk about the morning in the morning. People get tired and talk about it towards the evening. They're more excited by coffee, talk about coffee in the mornings, etc. See these spikes all of a sudden happen. I'm not sure exactly what event this is, but it's very clear. Yeah?
So, but it's not morning at the same time everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, but the network, so there's heavy skew towards English and North America. And you'll see it in 2 slides from here. I'll show it to you.
But you corrected all the time zones, right? You just aligned all the time zones?
No, we just take the data as it is, as it's coming in. So there's
right.
heavy, yeah, you see the diurnal patterns, and it's very clear that our time zone, or North America time zone, plays a key role in this data. So 3 different words. We see party, so as expected, rise in party towards the weekend. We see beer, which is quite consistent throughout the week. No rise or fall, which is kind of odd.
What about cottage cheese?
Yeah, that'd be good. And here you see people talking about hangovers. So note the massive spike Saturday morning and the massive spike Sunday morning. All of a sudden, massive spike. All right, here's time zones or language. Yep?
How do you know that's not political talk?
How do I know that's not?
That party isn't.
I don't know. This is just a general query. We can do, yeah, we can do much more complex.
Think about what would happen if he checks tea, right? Instead of coffee.
Right, no, exactly.
No one comes to our classes here.
All right, so what we have here are the different languages, and here's where you can see the comparative volume. English content, at much higher rates than Japanese in blue, and Spanish. In red, you'll see the Spanish content much wider because of the geography. Japanese content, sort of the opposite. The peak is where the low is for English content. That makes sense too. Notice the massive peak here.
Whoa. That was massive.
That was exciting. Yeah, I need to wake you up. Notice this peak here. If we zoom into that peak, we'll actually identify the type of event that is. And by looking at the data, it's clear that this peak is generated because of a game that happened here, actually, the 49ers against the Saints. And when you dive into that specific point in time, you actually see that this peak has its own unique curve. So almost every major game, entertainment game that we see in the network, the shape looks like this. So we can not only identify that there's something happening, some event happening, we can also start making pretty good guesses as to what the event is. If it looks like this, so there's sort of initial ramp up, and it slows down, and high peak towards the end, there's high likelihood that it's something related to a temporal event around sports, entertainment, something that, some competitive event that has a peak that people are very excited by. What else we can do is start comparing sort of trends. So how do trends look like when they peak, or as they evolve? And what you see here are two very different terms that trended on the network. So they had very similar levels of spikiness. But in blue is a hashtag, which is #BlameTheMuslims. Right? So this started by a Muslim woman in the UK who got really annoyed by the fact that Muslims were blamed initially for the events in Norway, the tragic events in Norway. So she started writing in the network. She was like, oh, your clock is broken, why don't you blame the Muslims? Or, oh, your car doesn't work, blame the Muslims. Her friends started reposting, and that sort of, it was their internal joke, and you see it sort of rising regionally. It became a local trend in their area, and then it sort of died down at night, but really picked up in the morning when more and more people noticed it on their stream, and then becomes a worldwide trend. Jumps context, people get really angry. They're like, why? How is blame the Muslims a trend? How can that be? Twitter should censor this. This is wrong. So that is sort of a self-feeding loop in itself, really spikes, and then there's an organic decline. We see this happen a lot with things that trend on networks. And what's interesting is to compare it to AJ Di Scala, which is some weird charity that wants you to, that's sending links online and wants you to click on different links that have to do with giving money. Right, so typical spam bot network, they reach quite high levels of usage on the network, but you see that it's almost as if somebody's turning a crank, so saying, okay, a little more, and you see there's higher levels. So crank was turned. We suspect it drew some organic flow here, but then the network realized that, turned it off. They weren't a trend anymore, and then they turned the spam bot network off. Right. So just by looking at the way sort of the number of counts and getting the shape of these curves, we can start to estimate that. First of all, to see that there is a substantial event happening. We can try to make guesses what type of event it is. And we can pretty certainly see if it's organic or automated. So one interesting thing that we were looking at a few months back, because we were seeing more and more people on the network accusing Twitter for censoring their trending topics algorithm. And so the story behind this, I mean, we all know the story of the occupation, started in mid-September, sort of slowly ramped up. There were all these events that were spiking, but the actual movement, Occupy Wall Street, had never trended on Twitter. Now, for those of you who don't know do you all use Twitter? I assume you all use Twitter, you all know. But the trends are generated geographically. So if you're using it in New York City and looking at the trends, you'll see a list of phrases or terms that are sort of hottest in your region. And Twitter isn't very clear about how they're calculating these, but they draw a lot of attention. So people, when they're talking about trending, they're referencing that. Occupy Wall Street had never reached that list in their interface, even though they saw a lot of content coming about Occupy Wall Street. And what we could do really simply is just look at a few different terms at that time in the network and over a period of time to really show why this was happening. So in dark blue is Occupy Wall Street. And you'll see it spikes at the very beginning with the initial occupation in New York. And again, you see the diurnal patterns. Some spikes around, I think this is Brooklyn Bridge, or this might be October 1st, yeah. So Brooklyn Bridge events drew huge participation. But note what else is happening at exactly the same time. It's hash what you should know about me, right? So I don't know, 6, 7 times the amount of activity on that hashtag. You should search it. I know what Kim K wedding hashtag is.
These are the hashtags that emerge when people actually want to have conversations. They're primarily started by Black, Latino, and young people, and they're done often initiated by comedians and a slew of other people who make it as their primary goal to create these mimetic conversations that are very internal.
All right, so just by looking at the traffic in the network and just by showing this, we could say that, hey, this is how it looks like. This is what we see in terms of the Occupy, sort of the amount of buzz that Occupy has been getting in the network, and we suspect that Twitter's trending topic algorithm is promoting content that's novel, so anything that's new that hasn't been seen yet, over anything that sort of slowly grows. So because of this, Occupy Wall Street will never trend, and mainly because of the choices that were made by Twitter in creating these algorithms. So what does it mean that we have these systems? And by the way, these types of like hotness algorithms are industry, like all major networks use sort of very similar algorithms to detect what's hot or what's trending. But what does it mean when we have these algorithms controlling the flow of attention, controlling what is important at these moments? So that was a fairly interesting insight from this study, and we published a lot more on our blog. So if we move away from simple counts, we can start looking at co-occurrences and relationships between words, right? This is a mapping of references of Mitt Romney versus references of Newt Gingrich. Again, this is all Twitter data. Right, so if we just, this is a very, very simple analysis. If we just take one versus the other and see and sort of implement a force-directed algorithm to lay out the graph, we sort of start to understand people's perceptions of these candidates just based on the language that they use. Right, so with Mitt Romney, at the time that we looked at this, there was a lot of talk about gay rights, LGBT, flip-flop, economy. Right, with Gingrich, it was Palestine, Occupy Wall Street, immigration. So there are more references of Newt Gingrich with those topics. And things in the middle are what we'd expect, like Republican, Dems, economics, amnesty, etc. So we can start to generate these types of things also in real time, and we can see these relationships and the perceptions of these candidates in relation to each other in real time, which is really exciting. So I want to talk a little bit about audiences as the core of what we do. We run a number of types of different analyses on audiences to try to understand what they're talking about, what they're doing, and what sort of generally interests them. This is a mapping. This is a mapping of the Al Jazeera audience at a certain point in time. So an hour's worth of conversations that were happening amongst people who are following Al Jazeera in the network. And what we witness is sort of a really interesting network where the central topics are what we'd expect from someone who follows Al Jazeera. right? So people who follow Al Jazeera, a lot of them tend to talk about Palestine. AJE Live was referenced often, right? Sort of Pakistan, so topics core to what Al Jazeera covers. But what we start seeing by mapping it this way are sort of regions in the graph. So we see Africa-related topics up to the top left. Top right is sort of China, different things around business in China. Bottom right are US politics and the GOP race. We see Jan 25 in Facebook, and all the way to the left, we see this group of Japanese people talking about Fukushima. Right? This is definitely not core to the audience of Al Jazeera. It's niche, but we can sort of see it once we lay out these graphs. Another thing that we could do once we have these topical graphs, we're seeing, okay, what are people talking about right now? How do they compare? So this is Al Jazeera in comparison to Fox News. Right, so core to Al Jazeera's audience are topics like we said, Tahrir, Jan 25, Wael Abbas, the blogger, while the Fox News audience, as expected, TCOT, which is top conservatives on Twitter, Joe NBC, Palin is there, right? So these are topics that they tend to talk about more. Now, we're seeing relations between audiences. What we can also see are the changes in the topic clusters. So this is the Guardian's audience, and this is taken, I think, a few weeks ago during Easter. So this was the morning of Easter, Saturday. There are all these folks talking about Bahrain, but you'll see the Easter cluster up there, right? So people discussing different topics around Easter. And what we do is track the change in these clusters over the day. So Easter stays prominent here, and Bahrain here, but you see sort of this US political cluster emerge, and this boat race cluster. So folks really excited by the boat race that's happening in London that day. So you see this really dense cluster emerge, and then it dies down by the end of the day. You see lots of entertainment-related topics that are prominent. Right, so we're really trying to track how. Sorry?
Was the boat race the one that was disrupted by the protester?
I don't know. Maybe it happened.
The guy emerged in the middle of the Oxford-Cambridge, and so that was actually a protest. The guy emerged, stopped the race. It was a big deal.
Huh? Yeah, I should really
That's
right. So it's not a boat race.
It wasn't a boat race. It was a protest.
That's a good point.
Well, we should dive into. Yeah, I mean, but it started as a boat race. So we
And became
see buzz. So the question is, 2 p.m. UTC, was that before this guy came or after? But yeah, that's worth checking.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the points are plotted? Is there distance represented by how close or how far apart they are? Size of the nodes, they make a difference. Is there any kind of dimensionality projected into the graph at all?
So the size of the nodes represent the prominence, the number of appearance of that topic or node in the data set. So the more times, like take me out, the more times hash take me out was referenced, the larger the node. And the relationship, so the distance between them are the co-occurrences, so number of times they appear together.
So the closer that
the closer that they are, the more times they appear together.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said it was a post-directed layout, right?
Yeah.
Is that the algorithm used?
This is actually using open ORD layout, so
Post-directed.
Post-directed,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay. So we're looking at what people are talking about. Another thing that we can see and are very interested by are what people are clicking on, and we can start sort of generating these very similar tag clouds, not only of what people are saying, but what people are clicking on. Because for the first time we have, and a lot of this data is public because of Bitly, so we have access to actual traffic counts. We can see for articles that the New York Times posts, how many clicks it generates. For articles that Al Jazeera posts, how many clicks or how much traffic one topic is drawing versus another. And we can start, creating these comparative tag clouds for the different media outlets. Again, note, what we see, the outcome, is not surprising at all. The Economist, pretty standard, world, politics. There was a big thing on yogurt that day, so people were very excited by that article. There was something big in the New York Times on basketball that day, again, pretty prominent. Al Jazeera, Middle East, IMF chief. And then Fox News, words like crime, Casey Anthony, and murder drew the most traffic to their website. And notice transgender clownfish, which was a terrific story about how the California system schools are introducing transgender clownfish in schools. Did any of you read the story? It's apparently a terrible thing that's happening.
So were these hashtags, these terms, or?
These are words taken from the article.
Words taken.
Yeah, not hashtags. So we're looking at topics that people are talking about. We're looking at what people are clicking on. But what's really interesting is to identify the shape, right? How are people connected? And I'll show you two very interesting examples of audiences. So in this case, this is a representation of the initial 20,000 users who shared the Kony 2012 video. So Kony 2012 video put out online by Invisible Children. It became the most viral video we've ever seen online. Right, 100 million views within 3 days, I think. And by now, I don't even know how many views it has. But what we wanted to do, we went back in the network to track out who were the first people to mention Kony 20, to reference that, Kony 2012 or Stop Kony, right? And we mapped out the people on a graph. The connections represent who follows who, right? Who's connected to who. And the size is a reference of their degree. So how important are they within the graph? And what we see when we run a simple clustering algorithm on the graph, we see these dense regions emerge, like extremely dense. And when we go into the actual profiles, we can actually identify geographic localities, right? So this group of people here are mostly in Dayton, Ohio. And even if in their profiles they have not referenced that their location is Dayton, Ohio, you can pretty much extract that because of their relationships and because of what they're talking about. So a lot of these.
How do you do it with the relationships and what they're talking about?
So a lot of these initial users who helped spread the video are teenagers. So they all go to certain schools, and these are some of the regions where the schools are located.
So they would reference something.
There were references to the school, but also because of the type of practices that these profiles have, they're much more likely to be connected to people they know, so people they go to school with. So if some of these people might not be in Dayton, Ohio, but the majority are. And we saw these dense clusters. So Noblesville, Indiana, Birmingham, Alabama was quite dense. There was a lot of initial activity there. And this is extremely interesting because this adds a different layer to the story. When journalists were covering the story about Kony 2012 and how it went viral, there was no mention of these pre-existing networks, right? That helped spread the video initially. These were all kids who were posting the video at the same time when the campaign started. And it's very clear from the data that this happened. Now what else is interesting is when you start looking at the profiles, you see that a lot of them have biblical references. So a lot of them have biblical psalms in their profiles and talk about God, religion, loving life, right? So that adds a really interesting dimension as to the source of this campaign. Do you want to say something?
Yes. Note these are the towns where Invisible Children showed up to either a school or a church. So this is actually part of why he's seeing that connection.
And where the company.
The organization showed up long before.
Save the Children has been doing evangelical work in those
Exactly,
towns.
yeah.
Right, so,
My son was doing the work.
and since we're here at USC Annenberg, we have to mention that there are folks like Melissa Ruff who have done extensive work interviewing both the Invisible Children organization and the kids who participate in these activities for years, looking at how they actually build this social process through face-to-face real-world actions to set up high school groups in hundreds of schools that do live screenings and build sort of, there's a social movement process behind this is the short version.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And it just pops and you literally get to see it here.
Right.
So adding the dimension of the data adds that part of the story which was missing when initially covered.
Okay, but so you said they're all posting at the same time, so there was some coordination involved.
Within a few hours. Yeah, it was coordinated. It was decided that this is when we're launching the video, and they were all a part of that.
Is this the entire network, or is it much bigger?
First 20,000. No, it's much bigger, but these are the first 20,000 nodes. More than that would have crashed my computer. So I want to show you another community that's very different, but you'll see sort of very similar outcomes from the same type of analysis. This is an analysis of some 20,000 or more, actually more, over 100,000 users who have Tumblr in their link. So in their profile, they link to a Tumblr page. So what we wanted to do is just try to understand, who are the Tumblr community and what can we learn about them just by looking at data. And what you see when you map out the relationships, so you see all these outcasts of the network, so people who have Tumblr links but aren't connected to anyone else with a Tumblr link, right? And then you see this really sort of dense middle section for this community. I call it a community. It might not be a community, but it's people who use Tumblr, right? And if we dive into some of the central nodes, you'll see the official Tumblr profile, for example. Okay, that has a Tumblr page. Sincerely, Tumblr is quite heavily followed because it curates content from Tumblr. You'll see all these profiles that put all these funny quotes. So these are sort of some of the larger, more prominent Tumblr curation sites. But if you dive into other sections of the graph, again, you'll see these really dense clusters emerge. And one of the most dense clusters is, not surprisingly, the Justin Bieber cluster, where people who are very excited by Bieber and also have Tumblr pages. Some of them related to Bieber, some of them not. But they're heavily clustered, so they follow each other because of their shared interests.
But these are directed or bi-directed?
These are directed. So what's interesting for me about this specific example is we see these dense clusters within this community emerge, some of them geographical because of language. So you'll see sort of the French Montreal area here, which are sort of is heavily followed. So all these Tumblr users who are writing in French and posting in French. You'll see sort of Spanish regions here. So these are people in Argentina, Chile, Venezuela. They're posting in Spanish, but they all have Tumblr accounts. But then you'll see the topical clusters also. So you'll see like Land of Justin Bieber, which are people from all over the world, from different parts of the world who have a shared interest and cluster around these interests. So what's interesting for me about this type of analysis is just by looking at the relationships between users and who follows who, we can not only start to see the geographic layouts of where these people are, but also the topical interests. And something that I think could be interesting to do is start to understand what's the difference between this type of community or this type of cluster and this type of cluster. So the geographic versus the interest-based. And we should talk about that at the end. So I want to jump, I'm going to jump two things to get.
Back up. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
I understand what's happening in this with these clusters. So these are arcs, and so what is it that makes two nodes be close together here?
So when two nodes are close together, it means they're part of a dense cluster of folks who follow each other. Right. So this is the path. So these are directional edges, and people who so if one follows another, there's an edge pointing to that direction. And by running quite a simple clustering algorithm called OpenORD on the data set, you sort of see these localities emerge where there's high following follower. So people who follow each other.
So if 5 people are all following each other,
they're more likely to be
as opposed to have those arcs going between the areas.
So in practice, then, once they're close together, they're mostly
they're part of
a.
Excuse me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's what.
You've got serious centrality is what ends up happening.
Is that clear? Is that?
Yeah. Okay. I got thrown off because you had said they're directed edges, but they're mostly bi-directed edges. There's A follows B and B follows A, and that's what makes them be close together in most clusters.
I could show you afterwards, actually. I could show you. They're not necessarily always bidirectional. But if they're highly clustered, yes, they're more likely to be bidirectional.
I think more importantly, if they follow 5 people, those 5 people, at least one of them follows each other. They don't have to be bidirectional, but that's still pretty
But close to that. Right?
Yeah.
Close to it.
Yeah.
And that must be the modal type.
Yeah.
That's
The size represents the
modal
degree.
motif.
So how heavily are they followed from within the network? So we're starting to run out of time. I want to focus now on a lot of the work that I do is trying to understand insight from this data. So what can we understand about audiences, how they're interconnected, and what can we draw from that? And especially how do I understand breaking news stories, events that are happening, but also how can I help our clients, media outlets, understand their audiences? And part of that work is also trying to understand information flow, so how it spreads. And this leads me to a project I worked on with Erhard, Mike, Devin, Ian, and Dana, and where we analyzed, a year ago, we tried to understand different aspects and dynamics of how information flows occurred during the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions. And we specifically looked at Twitter data to try to untangle some of these things that were happening. So the major goals behind the study was to try to understand the symbiotic relationship between media outlets and individuals. Right? We're seeing this emerge, and we talked about this earlier today, a space such as Twitter where we're seeing entities, organizations, and individuals sort of co-creating news and covering news and events as they happen. What role do individuals play, and what role did organizations play, and how did information actually spread and flow? Are there certain patterns that have occurred more? Those were sort of some of our main questions coming into this study. And we wanted to basically understand this evolving and dynamic relationship between traditional mainstream organizations and the emerging network actors. Right? So the different types of actors in the network who are working to co-create the news. So we defined our definition within the study of information flow was an ordered set of near duplicate posts. Right? So I post something to the network. Manuel picks that up, maybe adds a little more, posts it to his network. Somebody else picks that up, maybe posts identical or changes it a little bit, and posts that to the network. We aggregate all these separate messages, and we call that a single flow, right? An information flow. And what we wanted to do was try to untangle from these flows the different types of actors and the roles they played in spreading this information. You had a question, Karim?
Yes, one of the challenges that we had in our lab was really to try to go after those memes, right? What you're talking about are memes. You said it's going to change a little bit and change a little bit, and we had them clustered in one flow. How can you really? How do you know that it's the same tweet?
Yeah.
Without like looking manually at that.
Right, so there are ways, we use a certain technique called shingling to see how similar they are. But obviously, so the event might be a certain flow, but it also might be an outcome of an external event, right? We all experience the same event, and we write almost the same thing, even though it's not the same flow. So it's not precise. Obviously, there might be some events that were wrong, but the majority of times you could really see near duplicate texts referenced either the same exact events or the same original piece of content.
It's not necessarily the same tweet, is the equivalent meaning of the tweet.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's our definition of an information flow for the case of this study. We also define the source or the source type as the actor type, and we'll get to those in a bit. So every information flow had a source, and then length is the number of participants, so the number of people who participated in the flow. Just to give you a sense for the data that fed this study, we had about 170,000 posts from Twitter. either with the hashtag Sidi Bouzid, which was the main hashtag used in the Tunisian uprising, and the word Tunisia. That was about 39,000 users, and we had 230,000 tweets with Jan 25 or the word Egypt. We chose only flows that had size larger than 2, so we got rid of the long tail, and that we had about 20,000 flows for Tunisia, 29,000 flows for Egypt. And out of that, we took a sample of we took a 10% sample of the highest, or sort of the longest flows, because we really wanted to understand the dynamics feeding the information that really spread in the network. So we chose the top 10%, and then we took a random sampling out of that. Now, then came the extremely hard part of trying to understand who are these different network actors, and how do we define how do we even start defining the categories and place people in categories? And this was the part of the project that took us the longest. It was just to understand this framing and really come up with these buckets of actor types, which we thought were the most important in highlighting the information flows. So these are the bins that we had. We had a mainstream media organization, which is you can sort of understand, it's like Al Jazeera, New York Times. We had new media organizations, so blogs, so organizations that deal with media but don't publish anything, any piece of paper or magazine. We had non-media organizations such as Vodafone. WikiLeaks was hard. We didn't really know where to put it. We decided to put it in that bin at the end after a very long process of discussion. We had employees of mainstream media organizations, so journalists, who in their bios specifically say that they work for that organization. And a lot of what we did is look at the descriptions in their bios and see how they describe themselves in order to put them in that specific bin. Also blogger, really hard to understand. Is somebody a blogger? Are they a journalist? Are they an activist? Another bin, right? So these were the main. What else is important? We had bots were sort of some of the automated accounts. So if there was anything that fed information from a website to a Twitter handle, we called that a bot. So there were a lot of those types of accounts that sort of grabbed information from somewhere, posted it to Twitter, and were important in spreading the flows. So we went through a few rounds of user classifications, and we actually built out a system that the 5 of us used to categorize these actor types. Yeah?
Sorry, just I missed. So you're categorizing those who started the flows, the roots.
So we're categorizing anybody who participated in the flows that we were looking at.
Okay. Based on random sampling across all the...
Based on taking the top 10% and then random and then sampling within that.
Excuse me, so you sampled flows, not actors?
So we sampled flows, and then we took actors from those flows.
All the actors from the flows?
The majority of them. Yeah. Yes. It was a lot of actors. So we built this tool actually, which was quite neat. You have the leaderboard at the top, which tells you how many each person is already classified.
What's up, Devin?
Devin has 0. Devin did everything in the last day. You see how many remaining, and the way we did this was we fed each of the people that needed to be classified. We fed it to is it 2 or 3? I don't remember. I think 3 different.
It was 2 if it was automatic agreement. It was 3 or
right.
4 depending on non-agreement.
So fed it to 2 people. If they both agreed, it was never fed to another person. But if there was a disagreement, it was fed to another person. And we ran that cycle a few times because every time we ended the cycle, we saw all these folks we didn't agree on. We had a discussion, tweaked our definitions of these bins, and then redid it, and then had another discussion we did. So this process took a long time to do. But at the end, we had this really great data set of really neat data set of all these actors within the important flows and what type they were. So what we see here are Tunisia versus Egypt. The other category is quite large, and these are folks we just could not categorize. So just different accounts that didn't fall in any of the bins and were not worthy to justify a new type of bin, right? So that's about 25% in both cases. What we see a lot of bloggers in both cases. Journalists about the same number of percentage, activists as well. What's interesting is across both data sets, about 70% of the actors were individuals versus organizations. So we see much higher participation of individuals within these events. And what I can do is I'll just show you briefly the output, the tool that we have. So let me see. This is actually available online. We put out a visualization of all this data. So all these actors, all the flows that we analyzed, and sort of the output. So here we have Dima Khatib. She's identified as a mainstream media employee, and within this flow, it reached a number of people. Amongst them were activists and other, right? And what you can do actually with this data, we were excited to put it online, is you can really start exploring. So I have to unclick these guys. But let's say if we want to look at all bloggers bloggers and journalists across both, let's say in Egypt, we can sort of take a look at all these information flows that started from either a blogger or a mainstream media employee, and then we can actually dive in to see if it changes, how it changes. So here you see sort of the different changes. This person added the retweet symbol instead of the RT, and sort of where in the flow each person came in to be, right? So you can play with this. I'll share the URL, and I think it's in the USB disk that you already have. But if I get back to the presentation, what I really want is, yeah. So some of the output and some of what we saw. If we order information flows by source type, we notice that both journalists and activists had substantially higher sources, were substantially higher sources of information flows. In red is Egypt, blue is Tunisia. So in Tunisia, you'll actually notice that there were a lot of automated feeds, what we call bots, that were sources of information flows. What we also see, if we look at flows, so average, or in this case median flow size, is we see a slight difference between Tunisia and Egypt. Right, so in Tunisia, bloggers played an incredibly important role in surfacing the news. The flows that they started were much, much longer, right? Reached many more people compared to the other actor types. Versus in Egypt, we're seeing many more non-media organizations, such as WikiLeaks, who jumped in there, and we're seeing activists in Egypt. Another thing we looked at, so these were flows as a whole. What we looked at were what we defined as subflows. So relationships within the flows between the actor types. So instead of taking the whole flow, break it down into sort of small segments between these actors that we identified. And this just shows the subflows of the journalists. We ran this for every actor type. But what you see here, some of the interesting things that come up are across the board, the 10 most common subflow paths involve journalists, activists, bloggers, and the other category that we had. And then what's interesting about this specific case and the blogger's case, we really see high levels of homophily. So if you're a journalist, you're much more likely to repost content coming from a journalist. If you're a blogger, you're much more likely to repost content coming from a blogger, etc. Again, not surprising, but it definitely shows from the data.
But does this effect on be explained by the fact that journalists are more likely to link to other journalists?
To link to post content of other journalists. Do you mean?
No, but if there was.
Oh, to be linked
to.
Yeah. That's
actually so the link to journalists and the link to bloggers and others, but the reposting content from other journalists. Is that what you're trying to say?
They're more likely to source content from other journalists than from bloggers, even though they might be connected to more bloggers than journalists.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good question actually that should be investigated. We didn't investigate the connections between the people. We just looked at what they published. So we didn't look at the networked connections between them. So I'm just looking at the time.
So it would mean that maybe that they are following, that they are retweeting from other journalists, but as a proportion it may not be that much. In other words, they may be following 100 journalists and only following 10 bloggers.
Right, they might be.
And so then, even if all 10 bloggers, they're retweeting everything from all 10 bloggers,
they're not going to notice
right.
it. Yeah, or they might be following a lot of journalists, a lot of bloggers, but choose not to.
Exactly.
Because.
But that's an important question.
Yeah. So some interesting and important things, sort of outcomes from the study, and Dana, feel free to jump in. The methodology I think that we took was really interesting, and as a process for us, I think we learned a lot from that. And coming, like if we were to do a future analysis, we'd sort of start off where we took off by classifying these actors and using this sort of the mechanism that we used. I definitely revisit that methodology and use it again. We noticed from the outputs of the classification that different actors affected audiences differently. And like I said before, there were many more individuals that were sort of actively posting content, much more than organizations, and they had a higher reach within the data set that we were
looking at. There's more individuals than organizations on the network. So,
true. So that's right. So that's part of the
that they're necessarily more successful. They could have even been less successful and yet been the most common if they were actually disproportionately.
Right, but they also there's another aspect of that. The organizations tend to have higher rates of following, so they have substantially higher audiences than individuals. So even though they have higher audiences, and I agree there are less organizations available, we still saw much higher participation levels drawn from audiences of individuals, so flows that involve many individuals. But that's something that needs to be explored. I agree. We noticed this consistency in ability to command an audience, and a lot of this. A lot of the organizations actually are pretty consistent in the levels of sort of retweet and repost that they get. And many influential users, so users who were actually important in information flows, we could not categorize into traditional categorization schemes. So that was our large sort of other bin. So that was quite surprising for us. With regards to information flows, so this is what we just said. Individuals generally were more successful. And what's interesting about this data, and Twitter specifically, is it makes these differences visible. So the differences between the media ecosystem in Tunisia versus Egypt. So there weren't many journalists on the ground in Tunisia. And there's actually, there was, I think, previously or in the past few years, there was a ban on Western media. So there were not a lot of sort of formal media actors in Tunisia able to bring up information. So we see a lot of activists and bloggers as sources of information coming from Tunisia. And this is highlighted by the data coming about and highlights these aspects and these differences in the media ecosystem. With subflows, so again, we notice homophily prominent within the data, and there were a lot of retweets and repost interactions happening between the journalists and the activists. Yeah? Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Turn it to question and answer, or do you have more?
No, I have. So I've put together one final slide with different topics that I think are interesting for us to discuss. Some aspects of how we get this data, sort of the real-time nature of identifying trends and networks. So there are a lot of solutions to count data and like I showed you, create these schemas of what words are popular when, but there aren't many tools that give you real-time ability to identify network actors or network dynamics. So yeah, I mean, some like centrality and flows, like a variety of topics that I think would be possibly interesting to talk about. But if any of you have a suggestion or question or want to talk about something else, yeah. Go for it.
First, thanks for doing that work on starting the process of categorizing the actors, which I think is absent in a lot of studies that look at Twitter. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the boundaries and the gray areas and where you had to cut it off and create that other category. What were some of the categories that you considered that didn't make it into your final paper?
So the one was the social media pundits.
We had Digerati.
We had Digerati, but we separated it out from social media pundits. We're basically, it's amazing how many people identified as a social media consultant. We were really, I mean, it was just kind of overwhelming. Because a lot of the other are people who, when you looked at their tweets, they were jumping into this situation for a moment, but by and large just tweeted among their friends. So other was predominantly just folks who were just average people. And so it was just more a matter of, did we want to break down average people into different groups? And we decided not to break down teens or any of these other things. We just decided to leave them to sort of average
became really
people.
complicated really fast. So we had to have the other bucket. We realized that pretty early on.
WikiLeaks was other as well, you said?
No, WikiLeaks was a non-media organization.
I really like your presentation, as I like very much the paper that you put the whole group together, in fact. And in fact, has been a very influential article in my own analysis.
Thank you.
And among many other things, there are so many different things that you have actually discovered. But that there are discoveries. It's not simply a description. You are discovering key things. And for me, a key one is that you have actually identified the networks as networks of individuals, which is what, based on the qualitative analysis I have done on all kind of movements in the world, that I will talk something tomorrow about, is a defining characteristic of the current, not all, of the current network social movements. These are individuals connecting to individuals and diffusing information. And this is truly important in terms of then starting from there to characterize the whole thing. So, and the other thing is individuals, not simply as individuals, but as conveyors of information and creating together information flows. And it's the flow who is the actor. So it's a network actor which is made up of information. And the most solid empirical support that we have from that hypothesis that some people have is your work. So really, so make sure that it's correct.
So thank you for that. One of the things that I wish we had done, and we hadn't for that study, but I'm doing more and more now especially, is grab the network connections as well. So for the study of the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions, we only took the information and analyzed the flows. And I think what's interesting, like incredibly interesting, are the personal networks. So not only the flow of information, but also how the connections between people affect the flow. And right now, what I try to do whenever I look at, I've been looking at Trayvon Martin or just different, there's now CISPA, so CISPA, that's sort of, people are organizing around online. So not only look at how the message is flowing between people, but how they're connected, which adds another interesting layer to it.
Alex, and then Steve.
So my question kind of gets at what Kevin was getting at a little bit, but a little deeper. We've had conversations before in Civic Paths, the research group, about Occupy tweets and how you can definitely categorize by actor, but also categorizing by tweet behavior might be a bit more granular, but more interesting too. And that especially gets at more theoretical or methodological assumptions that you're putting into this kind of work, where you assume that people have brand identities in their profile, and that they can't necessarily tweet based on different behaviors that they might exhibit so that their one profile exhibits one behavior. And I wonder if you go granular, if it's just too much work to actually prove that assumption wrong, or if it really is the fact that people are behaving according to their one kind of face value Twitter profile.
Yeah, would you do that? Would you match their different profiles, or would you look at?
Well, I'm wondering if you literally need to go into every single tweet that they do and then compare it to the kind of overarching behavior that their profile dictates.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that.
I mean, it's like extreme amount of work, but at the same time, it kind of breaks apart the theoretical assumptions that you put into what a profile states about that behavior.
One thing I would say we concluded in all of this is that next time we will use mechanical Turk.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I can speak to how poorly that works, because in a project that we're doing at the Innovation Lab here, we tried to do some analysis on the GOP debates, especially how to categorize Twitter, like literal tweets. And by using Mechanical Turk, we found that there was actually decontextualization of the tweets, so people didn't actually match what the tweets were a week removed from the debate. So they might be able to say that it's sarcastic or not if they were watching the debate, but a week removed, they would look at a tweet and not actually understand what the impetus was behind the person posting that.
I think it's definitely true for content. I mean, certainly for the actor types. In terms of being able to scale and say, just the things were obvious were really obvious, but the things that weren't were where debate happens. And that's where I suspect that the same would be true for certain kinds of content, which is even being able to mark, like, no, don't know what the context is helpful. And that's where, trying to figure out ways of scaling some of these things, I think is a challenge.
What we talked about then, and what would have been interesting to do, is to look at, for example, geographic region. Is somebody in Tahrir, or are they in Egypt, or are they outside of Egypt? We tried to do that, but it was so hard that we just let go of that. And another aspect is trying to understand the type of message. Is it a call for action? Is it informational? Like, just trying to see which types of messages draw more participation. But again, that was.
So one thing I want to point out from that experiment, which was actually really interesting, is that one of the problems we had with coding where people were from was the overwhelming number of these actors who actually had constant geographic movement. They were from an environment, but they were living here, but they were speaking in this language. And we started to realize that given the dominance, we never basically went back and coded that properly, but given the dominance of these actors, there is something really important about the people who are really multi-located in a lot of this kind of information flow. Right, so this, is not, we found very few of the core actors were really truly from a place and speaking only in that language and really operating as such. Because I should note that not all of this was English, so we were also having to go through a lot of Google Translate to try to understand just location and whatnot. But that was a really interesting component to this that we didn't write up in that paper. It was just that these were a lot of actors who were actually already globally connected.
Last two questions, Steve and then Ray.
Could you speak a bit more to what you did to draw out the distinction between what you're calling a journalist and a blogger? And the reason I ask that is that in both Tunisia and Egypt, many of the bloggers were trained and had spent a lot of time in North America and Europe. Lawrence Pintack, when he was at the American University of Cairo, was involved in nurturing Egyptian bloggers as journalists. So in some ways, in pedigree background, the bloggers had a lot of training as journalists. How did you draw out those distinctions?
So it was actually, that list was in some ways in order, which was if they weren't this, then were they this? If they weren't this, then they were this. For the journalist bloggers, and basically we didn't want to get into that whole crazy debate, but we said in their profile, did they identify as being associated with a clear news organization? If they did, we labeled them as a media journalist. If they were identifying within a blog, like this is where I blog, or I'm a blogger, or any of this stuff, then they were a blogger. And so we weren't really getting into the political debates of are bloggers journalists, but just saying like where were they identifying?
And some of the bloggers posted regularly on media outlets, but they identified as bloggers, and that's how. So
you let the people identify their own categorization, and they might do that for various political reasons within them.
And we just accepted that and rolled with it.
Yeah.
Last question.
So I love what you're doing, and I want to talk more about the data at some point. Just have questions about it. But I wonder if have you tried doing sentiment analysis as a layer on top of this? I've seen like these studies where people will look at the public mood in relation to Twitter, and they can predict changes in the stock market and all this. Can you use it to like figure out who's antagonistic versus who's like connected and positively?
I haven't seen sentiment analysis that actually works on such short pieces of text. So everyone's trying to do this, especially with the elections coming up. But I would say it's extremely hard, and like we can identify extremely positive sentiment, extremely negative sentiment. But when I've tried it, the majority of content has come sort of somewhere in the middle. So it's not very interesting. What's interesting, I think, instead of thinking about sentiment, is thinking about the co-occurrence of specific words that might showcase some form of sentiment. So showing sort of words that co-occur with an issue when you know the words tend to reference certain sentiment, but with snark, sarcasm, it gets really hard. So it depends on the context.
And in this context, it's also acknowledged that we're talking about multiple languages.
Right. Yeah.
Like, this was not all English, and not only was it not all English, or like say, not all Arabic, the number of tweets that were both, like that there's some English, some Arabic, and a little bit of Spanish, and you're like, what are you doing? Right? And so that confuses anything.
You said global network.
But it meant it confuses also any of the linguistic trainers, like pretty badly.
I think we'll have a chance at dinner to continue this conversation. Peter's got